course, CNN's Fareed Zakaria, and CNN Chief International Correspondent Christiane Amanpour. Fareed, in the beginning of the decade, I guess few people would have imagined that we would be going to war in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Do you think we'll still be there in some form 10 years from now?
Most likely we will still be in Afghanistan. I think we'll probably be out of Iraq. And I think they illustrate the central challenge that the United States faces. For the United States to compete in the kind of world you're describing, it needs to focus in on the core elements of its power position: economic vitality, technological productivity, things like that. But yet, it is the sole superpower. And there will be crises and hotspots and flashpoints around the world, and they will pull the United States because it alone has the military. It alone has the capacity to act. But this is a double-edged sword. Britain was in quite a similar position at the start of the last century. You know, in 1900, if you looked around the world at every flashpoint, there were British troops trying to stabilize Iran. There were British troops trying to stabilize Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan, Somalia. And in all of those cases, what happened collectively is it distracted Britain from its core mission, which was to maintain its economic productivity, which is the basis of its military and political influence. So the United States will have to find a way to deal with these problems politically that will come up, and there will be others, Iran, North Korea, but at the same time keep its eye on the prize, which is it cannot go down too many of these quasi-imperial paths, or else it will sap its vitality economically and technologically.
Here at home.
It won't keep its eye on the prize.
And Christiane, how does it evolve? How does the strategy evolve? I mean, you're talking about 10 years, a long time. If we are still in Afghanistan, and if we are dealing with some of these other challenges, how do you see us moving in what direction?
Well, already the U.S. military at the highest levels, Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said that the United States will have to have long military partnerships with countries such as Afghanistan and Iraq, and maybe Pakistan as well, to try to keep all of this in some kind of level setting for the rest of the decade. It's not quick. The other idea is development. How do you make sure that these places which you have invaded and now you own actually are secure so that you can then leave at some point? And that will require nation building. And unfortunately in the United States, there is a collective allergy to that term. And yet, President Obama constantly speaks, even at the Nobel, about his admiration of George C. Marshall, who his name is on the Marshall Plan, and he talks at length about how what the United States did then stabilized Europe, stabilized Japan, and yet they can't talk about that in Afghanistan, but it does seem that they will be doing that. But even beyond that, a whole maybe new decade of constructive engagement instead of isolation. And again, we'll have to wait to see how this administration engages in places such as Iran with its nuclear issue, such as Burma, Myanmar with its oppression of freedom and the icon of freedom, Aung San Suu Kyi, such as Sudan, where there's the Darfur crisis, where they have to deal with a government run by an indicted war criminal. So, in other words, will there be a policy of engagement and mutual interest plus principle? So will pragmatism be married with principle? And I think people are still looking at that.
And put that in the context of influence that may be trumped over the next decade by China and India.
There's no question that the great story of this next decade is going to be the rise of Asia, the rise of China and India in particular. If you look at 2009 as a symptomatic year, this is the year the U.S. economy collapsed and the Chinese economy is still going to grow at 8.7%. No financial problems, no subprime loans, no maxed out consumers. And you are beginning to see the big emerging market economies, China, India, Brazil, take a path that is quite independent of what happens in the West. So far from being hooked on Western export markets, these guys are now moving, and they are developing a confidence politically, culturally of their own. And this is going to be the great story of the next decade. And it will take many twists and turns, by the way, because you will have the rise of China, but that will cause a certain amount of consternation in Japan and in India. So you see the Indians now looking at the Americans more carefully and saying, do you guys want to ally with us? So there's going to be a kind of complicated set of geopolitics take place, particularly in Asia. But all of it will be undergirded by this extraordinary renaissance of Asian economic power.
And a footnote to all of this. As 2010 begins, the world population is estimated to be just under 7 billion people. It will hit 7 billion people in just 2 years. $8 billion in the year 2028 and $9 billion by the year 2048. The dawn of a new decade gives all of us the chance to live our lives better, whether we're exploring outer space or the space between molecules, whether advances in medicine enable us to heal faster and live longer, or advances in technology help us reach out faster and communicate better. How we live with others in the world will always be the greatest challenge ahead of us.
I'm Dr. Michio Kaku. I'm a theoretical physicist and a science fiction fan. If an alien invasion force was hovering overhead, or an asteroid was hurtling towards the planet, you could instantly beam yourself out of danger. Cars would be obsolete. Airline food, a bad memory. Be there. If an alien invasion force was hovering overhead, or an asteroid was hurtling towards the planet, you could instantly beam yourself out of danger. It's zap to Paris on a whim, swing by Tokyo on the way home, and take in the view from the moon if I felt like it. A teleportation system would change everything.
And I'm going to show you how to build one.
I want my design to be the ultimate sci-fi teleporter. First, I need a very clear design spec.